just to introduce Keith. Keith is an assistant professor in ICT and digital learning in the Department of STEM here at Mary Immaculate College. And Keith's primary interests are around developing teachers' capacity, really to engage meaningfully and critically with digital technologies in their practice. His research includes such areas as teacher education, digital competency literacy, and educational technology, but also inclusive education. So Keith wanted me to keep that short, so I'll do that, and I'll turn the time over to Keith now. Thank you, Keith.
Sweet, thanks, Patrick. I'll just get the slide set up here, and we will be good to go. So that's there, and let's start. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many people here today as it stands. As Patrick said, my name is Keith Young, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about state of play of generative AI in education. Now, fair warning for this talk, it's going to be 50 minutes. It's going to be fairly fast paced. I mean, to be honest, if I had an AI do it, we'd probably be done in 15 minutes, and it would probably sound much more confident, but we are where we are, unfortunately. And look, just actually thinking about that idea of the AI sounding confident, the background image that I actually have for the slide right there, I actually had AI generate that, and I simply asked it to create an image to represent the state of play of generative AI in education. And I asked it then afterwards to explain to me why it created this image. And I just thought I'd go through that with you super quickly. So in the top left corner, you've got the chessboard with the GradCap King. It suggests that that's education, strategic state of play. The pieces are policy, pedagogy, ethics, and tech interacting moves with different trade-offs. The classroom desk with the circuit brain on the top right with a split screen. The boundary between school walls and always on generative AI, things about identity, privacy, and cognitive straddling and cognition straddling human and machine. The bottom left, the open book sprouting circuits to a light bulb, augmentation of learning, ideas emerging from the blend of content tools and student agency. And then the bottom right, it had hands with modular cubes, one with a network node, assembling the ecosystem, co-design, governance, interoperability, balancing innovation, and guardrails. And now, don't get me wrong, there's a little bit there that's a positive spin on it, but I was actually kind of surprised that off the basis of just asking it to generate an image to talk about the state of play of generative AI in education, it actually generated something quite interesting there from that perspective and the level of explanation it gave on it too. But now I digress. I have absolutely broken my slide per minute rule that I normally apply to presentations for this. But today we're going to be focused on breadth, not depth, like I said. So we're going to get started and make our way through. So typically speaking, if we're trying to imagine the idea of education versus Gen AI in and education, and if you imagine this line down the middle is some sort of a boundary or frontier of how we're going to cross over from one to the other, I feel like that there's so many things that I read in the media and online and from people who are just genuinely excited about this technology that just assume it's going to be as simple as, yeah, we have education and now we've got generative AI in education. But the reality is, if we take that frontier line, it's actually a bit more like a cliff. And we're walking off a cliff edge. And then once we get to the bottom, we're going to be in this rugged terrain that we're trying to navigate of generative AI in education and figuring out what way we go with this, if any way at all. And as any type of thing here where we're trying to navigate any of these areas, you know, you might want like some sort of a wayfinder kit. So you might have your compass to represent ethics and give us some values from that standpoint. We need a map, which could be policy in terms of being able to direct us and to see the landscape. We also need some rope for guardrails, whether that is best practice around assessment or pedagogy, or in terms of models being developed that have guardrails placed upon them to kind of restrict their uses in certain ways. And finally, we need a radio so that we can constantly stay in contact with the community. And that involves all stakeholders in this process, students, parents, teachers, school leaders, absolutely everyone, as we attempt to navigate and get perspectives around the use of this technology, if and how it should ever be integrated in education. But I am a firm believer that assuming if we can get all of this stuff together, that there is a chance that we might be able to navigate through it and get to something a bit more level and a bit more welcoming on the opposite end of it. Now, I want to start with generative AI models, and I'm going to start with a few statements that I hope won't be too controversial. Generative AI models are not intelligent, they cannot reason, and they don't really know anything. And that's kind of upset my little embodied AI robot down there in the bottom. At least in terms of how we define those terms in relation to humans. And I think that's a big challenge that there's been in terms of computer science, in terms of how they've utilized these terms. Artificial intelligence, I mean, goes back decades and everything like that. And I think that there's an element of conflation between these terms, and people conflict in terms of how these terms might be defined in computer science versus how they might be defined in other disciplines and everything like that. Now, if we think about the idea of AI and intelligence and reductionism, I'm sure many people have come across Emily Bender's fantastic work focusing on the idea that these models are stochastic parrots, they're synthetic text extruding machines. And to be completely honest, a lot of those claims were fair, and that pushback was great, because AI is full of history of claims that the brain equals neurons, neurons equal computation, therefore intelligence equals computation. Perfect, simple. And now we have large language models, and they seem to prove this view, but it's quite a reductionist view. Intelligence isn't just computation. And while Emily does remind us of that, and I think that pushback was really necessary in the early days when we were in the peak of the hype cycle. I mean, some might say we're still in a bit of a peak of a hype cycle. I do wonder if the metaphor itself, it's swinging the pendulum back too far the other way in some ways. Because the LLMs, while they are predicting the next word in a sequence like laying bricks, it's like saying that the house, or what is actually created by the end of it, is nothing but a pile of bricks, whereas it might miss the architecture and what people are actually being able to use these models for. Ilka Tuomi talked about this on LinkedIn, and I thank him for this, because it's a way that I've been thinking about this for a while, and I haven't been sure how to communicate, and he did so well. But it's this idea that intelligence is nothing but, and AI is nothing but. Both of them they flatten the richness of what intelligence could really be, whether that is human or artificial from that standpoint. And I want to make that point because people say that these models can do nothing, and it is simply not true. If we look at a state of play in terms of their benchmarking scores, and now look, benchmarks have their own limitations as it stands, but in terms of graduate level science questions, GPT-5 is pretty much peaking out there at the top of that, with math, oh, sorry, that's math level 5, apologies. The pink is GPAQ Diamond, which is high school, that's graduate level science questions. The frontier math are specific problems that have been designed that have never been seen before, so that there couldn't be any conflicts with the data that they've been trained on, that they just have the solutions. And whereas we started off with the models not being able to solve any of these problems that would take human mathematicians anywhere from days to weeks to solve, we now have some models that are scoring above 20% in those. So while these benchmarks do have limitations, the capability of large language models for a technology that simply predicts the next word based off the probability it's learned from its data, and how that's being combined with different tools, is very, very impressive. If we look at another one, now the idea of artificial general intelligence, or AGI, is just, it's pretty much everywhere when you're looking in the media, that this is what these companies are striving for. And there's a lot of difficulties around defining what the term is and what it actually means. Now, one researcher here, Francois Chollet, he's one of the main people that's behind the ARC Prize. And what they did was they designed a series of problems that are aimed at assessing an AI's ability to learn and generalize abstract visual reasoning skills from minimal examples to solve puzzles, much like a human would. And now again, he's a bit of a skeptic when it comes to LLMs. He does not believe that they will truly achieve AGI from that architecture alone, that we probably need some forms of symbolic AI in there as well. But even that being said, these models are scoring quite high with these. And those ones in the middle, the J. Berman and E. Pang, they're actually human created models using one of the other models. I think it was Grok 4, they tailored their own one, and they're scoring close to 80% in terms of the scores on this leaderboard as well. So the models do have capabilities, and they have significant limitations, and we're going to go through some of that. But a lot of the narrative out there is that there is nothing that these models can do, and I think that there needs to be pushback against that as much as there is pushback against the hype that exists as well. And one key thing that's always been talked about now as well is the AI bubble, and whether there is one and what's going to happen when it bursts. Well, the author of AI Snake Oil, one of the authors, I should say, Arvind Narayan, fantastic book, really kind of dealt with a lot of hype that there was around generative AI and LLM technologies and everything like that. He actually has a bit more of a nuanced take on this, which I think I agree with. So if we're thinking about this in terms of an AI bubble, you might talk about the key costs and profitability, and there's three main costs: talent, training, and inference, which is using the model. And inference costs themselves have come down over 100 times in the last few years. So these models are actually cheap to operate once they've actually been trained. And existing models could theoretically run profitably. What would happen if an AI crash happens, and he kind of differentiates it between the dot-com crash and other crashes of that nature, is that while research may slow and the products themselves are going to continue, you're going to have low running costs and you're going to have strong subscriptions. And smaller firms could replace larger players from that standpoint as well. And in reality, he's just saying that there is real value creation with this. And a lot of people do not want to recognize that. But AI is already delivering value to hundreds of millions of people. They would not be using it otherwise. And for the companies themselves, if they scale down their workforce and they just focused on the models that they currently have, there would be a tangible return on investment from that standpoint. And it's not just hype. Now, again, I'm deferring to his expertise and his knowledge around this area within there as well, and there would be other perspectives. But I don't think an AI bubble would be the exact same as a dot-com bubble because of all the infrastructure that has been put in place and by the fact that these models that currently exist will continue to exist. Now, in that context, I mean, there's still a lot of things that we need to discuss. We might talk about the ethical issues, and ethics in AI is almost like the terms and conditions that we all sign up for. Everyone agrees that they're important to have, but some just fly ahead without actually considering them in detail. And in this talk, I'm not going to be able to go into detail in every single one of them. I could do a 50-minute talk on absolutely any of them. But if we take some of the top ones that are there, like we know that bias exists in the models, whether that is indirect through the training data that they're trained on, or if that is direct from human intervention. And we've seen a lot of examples of that in popular media, and the potential for people who own these companies to manipulate the models so that they only speak a certain kind of truth. There's obviously the issues around copyright and theft of intellectual property, and it's really great to see that some cases are finally making their way through the courts and some settlements are finally being agreed to compensate people who have had their intellectual property stolen to train the models. There's the human impact in terms of both in terms of the labor conditions behind annotating, but also in terms of the resource extraction of rare earth minerals that are being used to create all these chips that are providing the infrastructure required for the models. Obviously, issues around accuracy of information and the idea of hallucinations from the models, but also deep fakes. I don't know if anyone saw this past week, but OpenAI released their Sora 2 model, and it really has me worried in terms of what this is going to do around deep fake technology. And then there's obviously the privacy and data protection elements as well. But two that I am going to focus on in this talk in a bit more detail are going to be the impact on cognitive skill development and the environmental impact. And we're going to start with the environmental impact. So if we take carbon emissions, for example, one rhetorical device that I see being used quite frequently by colleagues, by people in the media, online, is that training GPT-3, which was the first iteration of ChatGPT, had the same emissions equivalent of driving to the moon and back, about 552 tons of CO2. And that's a very stark number, when you actually try to put that into context, and then you're trying to say, yeah, it's like we drove to the moon and back. But let's put that in a bit more context, okay? So I ran the calculations on this. So if we're looking at average petrol car emissions per kilometer, we're talking about 170 grams per kilometer. Newer cars are much more efficient than that, but this is the global average that exists. And if we take the annual emissions per car, which is about 12,000 kilometers per year, depending on where you're actually based, we're coming up at about 2 tons of CO2 a year that are produced from driving a car. Now, if we work our way down through this table, and I'll get you down to the bottom, one thing that we do find out is, well, actually, the driving to the moon and back isn't exactly accurate. It would actually be driving to the moon and back 4.22 times would be the equivalent. And again, that sounds so stark. But let's put this carbon emission in the context of all road vehicle emissions. Well, if we do that, we get 0.000092% of overall emissions on an annual basis. If we put it in the context of all global emissions, that number decreases to 0.000015%. Now, that figure is old. 552 tons to train a model is not exactly accurate for what we have now. So let's kind of scale this up. And we do have limited data on this. And that's one of the problems that we do have with these companies is in terms of what they're disclosing. But a group called Epoch AI kind of have estimates around Grok 4, which is the one that's used on X Elon Musk's model. And they estimated that that was actually about 140,000 tons of CO2, orders of magnitude larger than GPT-3. So if we run the calculations on this one again, that number is absolutely massive in the context of, you're just thinking of it as an individual thing. But if we're putting it in the context of annual emissions for all road vehicles, we're at 0.0023%, and as all global emissions, 0.00037%. And again, I'm not completely trying to minimize these. These are significant from that standpoint. But the other thing about this is you're talking about the carbon emissions from training a global system that is utilized by hundreds of millions of people. And so it's to try and put things in the context from that standpoint. The other thing, oh, and sorry, I should point out as well that right now global data centers they're responsible for approximately 0.5% of global emissions, and that's expected to double by 2030. So by 2030, they'll be in and around 1%. Some of the cases go up to 1.4% of global emissions. But the IEA, the International, I'm sorry, I can't remember the actual thing in the acronym, they actually believe they're going to be a relatively small contribution in the short term. They peak and then stabilize or slightly decline from 2030 based on the models that they have because of efficiency gains in chips, algorithms, and larger data centers. Now, the other one that I do see quite often is water usage, and this was quite recent that I actually saw someone speak and state quite categorically that having ChatGPT generate a 100-word email uses the equivalent to 300 milliliters of water. That figure has no basis in reality. It's completely inaccurate. The actual figures are actually anywhere between 1 to 3 orders of magnitude less, depending on the model that is used. So we're talking either fractions of a millimeter to anywhere up to 30 milliliters, depending on the model that you use. And don't get me wrong, the figures that are in the scale there at the top level, when you're looking at the reasoning models from OpenAI like O3 Pro, GPT-5, etc., there are significantly larger risks there because of the compute that's required for those reasoning models. But there are smaller models that exist and much more efficient models that can significantly reduce this, which means that there could be a path forward for us, assuming we can regulate the way some of these companies are engaging with it. But also using rhetorical devices of 300 milliliters of water for a 100-word email are not going to really help us advance the discussion as we move forward from that perspective. The other thing that I would point out, again, is the other one that gets commonly used is ChatGPT uses 10 times more energy than a regular Google search. And that's true, but all of it, again, is heavily dependent on the query that is asked and the model that is used. So if we look at the estimates for OpenAI from the same group that I got those stats from before, if for OpenAI models, for 67-word input, 200-word output, the output ranges anywhere from 0.12 watt hours to 18.26 watt hours, and all models 0.05 watt hours to 21.72 watt hours. For context, that original Google search energy use is generally quoted as 0.3 watt hours. But to be honest, I think that was a figure from a decade ago at this stage, so they're probably much more efficient. But let's just say that we go with it. It's 10 times more than that figure, and it's 3 watt hours. I decided to run a little experiment on this. So here are the assumptions that we're working from. Average household electricity consumption in Ireland is approximately 4,200 kilowatt hours. The average people per household is 2.74, and that works out at an average electricity consumption per person of 1,532 kilowatt hours. So if we take that 3 watt hour per query stat that gets quoted quite frequently, and let's just say a user engages with ChatGPT 50 times a day, that would be right now on current estimates quite excessive, but let's say they do it, and let's say they do that over the course of a year. Basically, that works out as being 3.6% of the average person's total electricity use in a year. And I wanted to put this into context, and I thought I would do it in terms that Irish people would hopefully enjoy, and that would be in the context of a cup of tea. So I went and I boiled my kettle, and I set a timer for how long the kettle would boil. And I took the energy rating of the kettle, and basically I did all the math of it again as well. And I tend to have 2 cups of tea at least a day, one in the morning, one in the evening. And so actually using ChatGPT excessively with 50 queries a day would probably be the equivalent of me boiling the kettle twice a day to have a cup of tea. Now, again, these figures are not insignificant. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I think it's important that when we talk about issues regarding climate and how these things impact upon it, we need to look at it in the context of other uses that are going on and what is actually what is being gotten from these models for the people that are using them. For example, like we need to really focus on the localized impacts of where data centers are built. Some of them are being built in areas with arid conditions where there's very little local water in the first place. We need to focus and continue focusing on decarbonizing our energy grid. We particularly need to make sure that we curb infinite scaling from these companies, because if they try to keep scaling up so fast and try and keep larger and larger data centers to larger and larger models, it's going to force energy providers to rely more on fossil fuels, and we need to avoid that. And we also need to improve reporting requirements for model efficiencies and impact. And actually, there's one company called Hugging Face. They host a bunch of open source models that people can play around with. And they do a lot of research in terms of the environmental impacts of AI. And one of their researchers, Sarah Lucioni, has actually done work to try and develop an AI energy score label, similar to what you might have on a white appliances in your home as well, so that consumers can actually make informed choices around which models that they use. And I'd be completely supportive of that. And everything that I'm saying here, I really want to emphasize, it's not that we halt efforts and we be conscious of this stuff, but we put these arguments in the context of what those real impacts actually are at scale. Now, to actually focus in a little bit more on education itself, we've seen a plethora of companies trying to get their way into the market and providing tools and products and software and solutions to schools and everything like that, whether that's ChatGPT Education, Gemini for Education, Magic School, which is a one-stop shop for a load of different types of tools that teachers could use to generate resources and materials, or in fact actually open up rooms so that their students could play with very specific tailored bots, and CurePod that will generate presentations for you with interactive elements in them as well. And with all these companies, we obviously have to be careful of their encroachment on the education system, because EdTech itself is never just about technology. Tim Fawns reminds us that it is entangled: pedagogy, technology, context, values, and the purposes of education. Selwyn warns of the privatization of public education and corporate control over key educational practices. And Williamson, McGilchrist, and Potter highlight datification and schools' increased reliance on webs, platforms, and data infrastructures. A core example of that right now is Blackboard. I think it's gone bankrupt, and so there's a lot of institutions in the UK right now are wondering what that's actually going to mean for their learning management infrastructure. And of course, like we've seen, ChatGPT are doing collaborations with Common Sense Media now about online misinformation and deepfakes immediately right after they release Sora 2. And Meta has announced that they're planning to use chat data for targeted ads as well. So we can constantly see these issues as they're arising. And off the back of this, I mean, there's been for quite a while now, there's been a growing range of critical scholarship in the context of educational technologies. But in particular as well, there's a lot of growing scholarship in the context of AI. And two key publications I would just signpost here for you, for anyone that's looking to get a lay of the land from that standpoint, would be this publication from UNESCO, which came off the back of Digital Learning Week, which was held a few weeks ago. And this paper here from Wayne Holmes and a bunch of other researchers who collaborated to put a stake in the ground around critical studies of artificial intelligence in education. Now, I'm not going to lie and say that I completely agree 100% with every perspective in these documents, but the perspectives the voices that they're bringing to the fore here are going to be crucial in terms of how we navigate this area as we move forward. And we are going to need to navigate it in some way, shape, or form, because generative AI poses some problems for us. So Punya Mishra had released a blog recently where he talks about the expertise paradox with generative AI, and he's basing this on a discussion of a paper released by Microsoft on critical thinking in relation to AI. And he highlights kind of 4 key dimensions that are associated with this, mediated by the level of knowledge a person has of AI and the level of knowledge they have in the domain in which they're using it. So the novice's dilemma is where they've no domain or AI expertise, and these are the most vulnerable because they can't judge the accuracy, and they could be misled. Confident friend who's often wrong. The expert's advantage is they're domain expert. They have little, apologies, I just need to move something on the screen. They have little AI knowledge, they're cautious but capable, they can test AI against theory and evidence. The false confidence trap, where they're AI savvy, but they've no domain expertise to actually be able to evaluate the outputs of the AI. And then the dual expertise challenge, where domain AI and knowledge, they have both domain and AI knowledge, and they get the most reliable results off the back of that as well. But it's mentally demanding, and it's a constant two-track evaluation. And so there's a lot of mental effort that has to go into engaging with these models in and of themselves. And when we're talking about how we engage with them, there's three main ways that we can kind of conceptualize that, and that gets spoken about a lot. And those would be augmentation, collaboration, and automation. Now, the nice thing about augmentation and collaboration to a certain degree is that they maintain the idea of a human in the loop process. So that there's constantly a human in the loop that is evaluating the outputs, making determinations of whether or not this information is useful or should be used. But the problem with automation, and it's much more problematic from that standpoint, is it raises the question of exactly what decision-making processes or what mental processes we are automating at any given time. And when we think about how people are actually using this AI, these models, a lot of companies have recently released statistics on how they are actually being used. And so this paper from Jatari et al. Highlights ChatGPT's usage, and you can see that at the bottom, like 8.3% of people are using it for practical guidance, and that includes 10% for tutoring or teaching. 21% are using it for seeking information, 28% are using it for writing, and there's a whole bunch of other tasks that are contained within there as well. But if we look at another slide that kind of breaks down exactly what it is, what the nature of the query is that they're asking within each of these, and they categorize them in three ways, that a user is either expressing something to the model, they're either asking something from the model, or they're getting the model to do something. And if we look at the stats here, like 39.8% of people, like the average amount of tasks that are being done there, they're asking it to do something for them, whereas 48.9% are asking them questions and engaging with them from that standpoint. And where this becomes problematic is when we're thinking about the offload that happens here, the cognitive offload and the things that we're not practicing. And in particular, if you look at the writing, 22.1% are getting the model to do their writing work for them. We can see that that's going to be problematic down the line. And there's plenty of examples in the media right now of people being caught out, having used AI undisclosed, made up citations, made up facts, and everything of that nature. But people are using it. They are finding that there is some value for it to them. We can debate whether or not all these uses are ethical, but some of them I would wager could be deemed as ethical depending on the nature of the interactions. And one thing that is coming out from that, particularly in the context of teaching, because we're marketed so much that this will make teachers much more productive, is the idea of the productivity myth. And Selwyn and colleagues had a paper released in the last 2 months, I think, where they kind of examined this. And they suggest that, yeah, the productivity gains are a little bit of a myth in that there's hidden labor involved in fixing and editing outputs, that there's frequent breakdowns from the model, the consideration to human judgment is still central, that professional expertise piece, and that there's a false efficiency associated with this too, that Gen AI often takes more time than doing the tasks manually. And that there's that professional moral tension there as well. And the paper is really valuable in terms of dissecting all of these areas, and they're really important moving forward as we attempt to try and explore if or whether there are any elements that could be productive. But if I might offer a slight critique on this, I would say that we don't necessarily have enough data to make this conclusion just yet. And on the paper itself, there is no actual measurement of time. They talk about the nature that some teachers feel like it takes them more time, and I've no doubt that it probably does with some tasks, but we don't have a measurement of time in this paper. The other thing that I would say is that there is a small bit of a reference to someone who was considered to be a power user, and it was framed as though, as expected, we had some people that said this. And of course, they were suggesting that it's the fault of the user and not the tool. And I get adopting a critical sociological perspective invites the fact that, yeah, we've had a lot of tools that have been sold to us in the past where obviously it's the user is the problem, not the tool itself. And we need to fight back against those narratives. But when it's a user that's actually saying it from that perspective, and it's reasonable to assume that with any type of knowledge or skill or new thing that you're using, that there might actually be a bit of a teething period in terms of figuring out how it works best for you. I wouldn't be so dismissive of those perspectives from that standpoint, that they are potentially worth exploring. And it's worth delineating between what might be productive uses, what might be time-saving uses, and what would be completely unproductive from that standpoint too. For example, I don't think LLMs are very good at doing a complete lesson plan, but if I've got a topic and want to generate a set of questions, it can do a pretty decent job at generating a set of questions quite quickly for me. Just saying that it could be worth exploring further. And there is some research, limited, we don't have a lot right now, but there is some research to suggest that there is some time savings that could be derived from this. So from this study here, there was a 25-minute a week saving just in relation to year 7 and year 8 classes. It was self-report, so we have to take it with a pinch of salt. There was no quality difference between the lesson resources, between groups, the control group and the group that used generative AI. Again, small sample, we need to treat it with caution. They actually noticed that usage declined over time as people became more familiar and they identified where they wanted to use it on specific tasks and what things they didn't want to use it for. Those things were primarily around quizzes, questions, and activity ideas, not full lessons. And the time that they got was reinvested or saved for other planning tasks or workload reduction. So I don't think we have the data yet to see what is going to be the outcome from this. I do believe that there are things that it won't be productive at, but I think it would be a bit remiss of us to kind of completely exclude the potential that there could be things down the line. And to be clear with this, displacement is not a foregone conclusion with this time displacement. Neither is the idea that if they get these efficiency gains, more is going to be expected of teachers. We can fight these narratives. We still have a funding crisis in education, and we need to resist at any attempt that if this technology does turn out to have productivity benefits, that we resist any attempts to use it as a band-aid for the education system that is chronically underfunded as it stands. These things do not need to be mutually exclusive. So we need to be aware of them as well. And as well, like I've spoken there about productivity and everything like that, but those aren't the only ways that this is used. I mean, people are developing resources for themselves from a UDL perspective, simplifying text, creating sets of tiered questions. Other people are creating their own chatbots and agents, creating different forms of dialogical teaching and everything like that. There's a lot of experimentation that's going on, and there's some early promising results. There are other results that don't bode too well at all. But we need to evaluate all the evidence as it exists so we can try and chart a path forward. And this is going to be particularly important because when we talk about learning, we run a lot of risks with this. So in terms of thinking about this, there were early comparisons, the idea of it being a calculator, because, you know, calculators allowed us to offload certain calculations, allow us to do other things, and ChatGPT and other models, they allow us to offload stuff so we can do more complex things as well. But this really interesting paper from Lodge et al. Really decided to try and explore, well, we've got decades of research already that looks at the idea of human and computer interaction. What could we learn from this if we try to apply it from human generative AI perspectives? And again, they highlight this from the perspective of offloading or extending our capabilities and getting the AI to do things versus working on it collaboratively with them as well. And the idea here is that there's different forms, kind of relating back to that idea of the augmentation, the collaboration, or the automation, but that there are different ways we can envisage that the technology could potentially be used. And one thing that we do know is if it's used incorrectly, generative AI can harm learning. And this study gets brought out constantly. And most recently, I saw it brought out during the Royal Irish Academy once again. And one thing that I bring up about this study in my talks is that I always talk about this because people keep doing the same thing with this study. They seem to only be reading half of the study. So it was an experimental study that had several test conditions. There was obviously a control group here, but there was a test group, and the test group were given access to ChatGPT. Now, during the practice period, there was a 48% improvement in practice performance for that group base in comparison to the control group. However, when that was taken away, there was a 17% reduction in performance for the unassisted evaluation. So it gave them a leg up to start with, but if we took it away, it ended up damaging learning because they're outsourcing all their thinking. And this was presented recently as though that was the test case. There was the control group and there was this one. There wasn't. There was a third test case. And the third test case was a very tailored model that they called GPT Tutor. For this test case, there was a 127% improvement in practice performance. And then when they took it away, there was there was no statistically, they were statistically indistinguishable from the control group. So what this suggests to us, and it's one study, we're going to need more and they need to be evaluated much more rigorously as well, is that while wholesale access to any of these models can undoubtedly damage learning if they're used irresponsibly, tailored models actually provide a solution that could really help learners when they're engaged in independent practice, while also not having any negative outcomes on their learning thereafter. And so if we're going to present these studies around the impact on learning, I think we need to be presenting them in whole. And this isn't just this study, it's a trend. Lehman et al., they learned that when students used the LLM as a tutor, questioning and explaining it, and then if it hurt learning when LLM is used to bypass thinking, just getting solutions. Another study, Yan et al., found durable learning gains when the AI agent provided scaffolding, actually outpacing the scaffolding alone with no AI, and it outperformed both the passive agent and the one that had no AI as well. So there are potential ways that this technology could be used to the benefit of learners while also not necessarily seeing any negative aspects from their learning standpoint and potentially some gains. But we need more research. It's by no means definitive. And Weidlich et al. Did a recent review of some meta-analyses that had been published about the impact on learning that were saying there were massive gains with learning. And when they conducted the analysis on these meta-analyses, they found that there's a lack of methodological rigor in them. And that methodological rigor extended down to the studies that were included within the meta-analyses, which had loosely defined treatments, there was mismatched or opaque controls, and outcome measures with unclear links to learning. And from this perspective, it means that we need more quality research to actually examine these impacts before we jump to any conclusions around the overall impacts that they could have on learning, because the early evidence suggests that there could be some potential if we explore this from a pedagogical perspective, not just the fact of if AI is used, but how AI is used. And that idea around the if or the how really comes into this idea of what is being coined as metacognitive laziness. So Fan et al. Conducted a study and they've come up with this term. They may not have been the first ones to coin it, I'm unsure on that. But metacognitive laziness is when learners let the AI do the thinking work. And what they found was that a lot of the learners that were using AI, they kept going back to AI instead of cycling through plan, try, check, and revise themselves. And while their performance went up, their deep learning didn't. So if we're using this to take shortcuts in terms of cognitive processes, there is undoubtedly going to be harms that result from that. And that applies to learners of all ages. That applies to people who work in any sort of profession. If we're outsourcing too much and not engaging critically with these models and not checking our work, there is some damage that could be done from that standpoint. But then let's think about AI feedback. So how does AI compare to human feedback? Well, if we talk about it in terms of its impact on performance, the early studies that we have right now suggest that it's actually fairly comparable to human feedback. Across several studies, they suggest there's no statistical difference in student performance, though there are some studies to suggest that there could be discipline-specific nuance from that standpoint. So this could impact on different subject areas in different ways. If we think about it from the perspective of perceptions, this is where it gets more interesting. So students actually really value AI's speed, detail, and availability, but they really prefer the nuance and empathy of human feedback. And so from that standpoint, if we break that down in more detail, there's some studies that looked at more detailed quality metrics. Human feedback was always rated higher, especially for clarity, prioritization, and tone, but the gaps were small and they were narrowing. And actually, interestingly, there was another study where students were given feedback blind. They didn't know whether it was from an AI or from a human. And if they were unable to distinguish it from guessing themselves if it was AI or human, they actually preferred the AI feedback more than the human. But once they found out that it was AI, then they were quite upset with it. But what it suggests is that the way forward around feedback suggests there might be a hybrid approach here where there is a specific use case for AI feedback, but not to the detriment of human feedback and the importance of it from that standpoint. And it's why I do get worried when people are using AI to provide feedback for their students. I think it's fine for a student to engage with an AI to get feedback for themselves, but we shouldn't outsource that sort of thinking and that sort of value that we can add to our students' work by just generating AI feedback for them instead of giving it to them ourselves. And all of this is kind of tying into the idea of assessment. And the AI assessment scale from Perkins, Rowe, and Furs has been going out in full force. It's been adopted in a lot of different areas and being tailored to specific contexts. And the key thing with this is they've really emphasized in a recent paper they just published, I think they're calling it the V2 of the AI assessment scale, is that it's not meant to be not to be used as a policing tool. It's meant to be used as a design tool for considering how we might design our assessments moving forward. And in that context, thinking about assessments, it's a wicked problem. It's wicked in that there are no perfect solutions here. Everything is going to have a trade-off. Whether you want to go back to just proctored exams, whether you want to try and leave it open and work in conjunction with it, there's going to be trade-offs from that perspective. And recent work from Corbin et al. Engaging with higher education professionals, they've suggested that there's 3 permissions that should be granted to educators from this standpoint. That they should be granted the permission to compromise, that accept that there's trade-offs and there's no perfect balance. They should be granted permission to diverge, so allow context-specific approaches across disciplines, permission to iterate, design assessments as evolving practices and not fixed products, so that we create an ecosystem where people can try and figure out and try and navigate this as they move forward. And all in all, what I'm trying to say here is that LLMs could have a place in education. We don't know fully yet. We don't know what the full impacts are. We know that wholesale access to any of these models and used irresponsibly is going to do damage to learning. But there is some evidence to suggest that if these models are tailored correctly, that if we encourage appropriate self-regulation strategies and how we engage with them, that there could be benefits that we could be derived from them. The key thing is that pedagogy must inform their use, not if it's used, but how it's used. We need to consider those tailored models, and again, that idea of self-regulation and ethical approaches too. And in terms of how we're trying to navigate that as well, we are starting to see the policy landscape develop from that standpoint. So the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, I think most of the elements relevant to education came into force in August, or at least the requirements for the providers, the people who create the models. And it's going to have some implications for us in the education sector. So from schools, universities, and institutions, they must audit any AI tool use or planned use. And if there are high risks, they're going to have to do compliance documentation, and they're going to have to provide, any deployment of AI, providers must provide training to staff, whether it's high risk or less than that. What we're considering high risk, or what they consider high risk, is that any systems that help determine access, admission, or assignment to educational or training institutions, that evaluate learning outcomes or steer learning paths, or that monitor behavior during exams and tests. So all of those are considered high risk. And if any systems fall into that category, all of those processes will have to be gone through. EdTech vendors and providers, they're going to be required to design AI systems, robustness, with fairness, explainability, human oversight, and documentation. For teachers and staff, they will need to understand AI tools, their limitations, and they may need training and institutional support from that standpoint. And for students and learners, they're the beneficiaries of protections as well, in terms of transparency, fairness, and contestability of any decisions that are made from this perspective. But also, there's a lot of ongoing discussions around children's rights, around data and online activity. And if we have them engaging with these models, what is happening to that data? And if elements are being captured, for targeted ads and everything like that down the line. And I believe Sonia Livingston had a recent report out that actually examined that in the context of 4 key tools that are being used. And there are risks and there are challenges there that need to be overcome. Specifically in the Irish context, we have a lack of guidance still. It has been ongoing for quite a while now, where I don't know, at least 1 or 2 ministers of education have promised it will be coming out. The latest we've heard is that it's going to be coming out in the coming weeks. So fingers crossed that will be actually happening. And I know I might sound a little upset there. Like I don't envy the work that needs to be done there. But teachers need guidance, and the guidance is going to be imperfect, and it's going to have to iterate, and we're going to have to figure it out, but something needs to be provided to them. And despite all that, no guidance being given, AI is still being allowed in coursework. So for the last few years in project coursework at junior and senior cycle, there's a tagline in there that AI can be used. But again, there's no specific guidance yet on how that can actually be realized. It's gotten to the point now where the ISTA have actually developed their own and published it. And so teachers are taking it upon themselves to try and provide support to one another. And IDID themselves have released good practice videos too, which some of those videos, they actually do go through a lot of the ways that the technology could be used effectively, particularly from a UDL perspective. So I encourage people to check that out. IDID tried to do a lot of great work up there, and that should be recognized and valued as well. But from this perspective, irrespective of what guidance is going to come, there's a desperate need to future-proof school policies. And Anne Marcus Quinn and Selena McCoy had a paper published, I think it was just in the last week or 2 weeks, where they looked at the acceptable use policies of schools, and only 6 schools had policies that were current for 2024, 2025. None of the schools had AUPs contain any AI-specific guidelines. There were clear demands for support from school leadership, and within them there was some cautious openness to the idea of AI, but a lot of strong concerns about it as well. So it's a lot of work that actually needs to be done to that as we move forward. And one of the things that's being used to try and help with this is the idea of AI literacy frameworks, and there's a multitude of them being developed. And the one here on the right is the EU OECD's one that is currently out for consultation. UNESCO have their own guidance as well, and DigComp 3.0 is forthcoming. And I know that there's a lot of arguments against these frameworks of, oh, now we've got another literacy framework, now we need to do this, and how, what's going to be the churn or shelf life of this technology, and are we just enabling vendor capture and all that? And some of those concerns are real, they do exist, but the ecosystem that we currently live in is children are exposed to this technology, and it exists. So I think irrespective of whether there's decisions made about how generative AI is used in education, or how to use it, we definitely need to teach about AI. And that's going to be a key part. And from that perspective, there's a lot of great calls that are happening around the development of critical AI literacy from that perspective. And one paper that I actually do love that really enables the idea of exploring critical AI literacy with learners of all levels. It depends on which one you would want to choose. But is the idea of using metaphors to explain generative AI. And these come from Roe Perkins and Furs as well, the same authors behind the AI assessment scale. But they explore the idea of AI, generative AI as digital plastic in terms of it creating synthetic data or AI slop that could flood the internet and damage our epistemic ecosystems. There's the idea of the funhouse mirror of how the generative AI models can distort reality and not exactly tell the truth. And that it can be used as an echo chamber to reinforce, our already currently held beliefs rather than challenging them, or if there's, conspiratorial thinking or anything like that, or, false reporting in the media, whether the models can challenge that or whether they reinforce it. Or the idea that AI is a black box, that in reality, we're not fully sure exactly of all the workings that are happening within these models. There's no explainability there to completely understand, if you put in a specific prompt, why have I gotten the exact output that I've gotten, and why if I put in the same prompt again, I would get a different answer the next time round. And these are all super useful for exploring AI. And I think that we need to start doing that because, like I mentioned already, students are using this technology. If we're looking at latest stats, and if anyone knows of better stats, please let me know. But the only stats I've been able to find in the Irish context are from CyberSafe Kids. But from their recent study, 26% of 8 to 12-year-olds have used a chatbot, which is up from 5% last year, and 36% of 12 to 15-year-olds have used the chatbot, which is up 12% from last year. And those increases are significant. And a lot of the models they might be using could be the Snapchat AI. Maybe I'm out of touch now. I'm not too sure if the younger generation are still using Snapchat or not. But the fact that they are being used, irrespective of whether or not we engage with them in the education system, and considering whether or not we can fully control whether with young people with technology will have access to this, I think that there is a need that we need to address it in some way, shape, or form. Because not only from the perspective of learning, Mishra, McCaleb, and Oyster have released a paper as well, where they talk about how generative AI can reshape human emotion, identity, and relationships, not just the learning. That it can create artificial intimacy, forming emotional bonds with users. And we've seen that. There have been some reports in the media that people have formed relationships with these models, that they have trusted them over going to trusted people in their life. And that has resulted in some instances, or claimed in some instances, that the models have led them towards taking their own lives. I'm hesitant until cases are resolved to come to firm conclusions on that, because anything of that nature would be inherently complex. But irrespective of what the conclusion of those would be, we are aware that there are challenges from this standpoint, because these models are created to be human-like. to kind of reflect us from that standpoint. So there's a need to include a recognition of that as well in any type of AI literacy to understand the potential of AI's emotional influence. So if we're to summarize kind of key takeaways, or what I would hope would be the key takeaways from this talk, first thing is that we need more regulation and reporting of and from AI companies, particularly around the environmental elements, and there should be legal requirements there. I think the EU AI Act has contained some of them, and whether they've fully come into force yet and whether AI companies have made those submissions, I'm unsure of right now, but there needs to be more of that. And we need to consider that if this technology is to keep scaling, that there could be significantly detrimental impacts on the environment, and that the company should be curbed from that standpoint. We need to be conscious of metacognitive laziness, and I think this will be one of the biggest challenges for us, not just as learners, but as a society, that if people start using this technology, it could be tempting to just outsource many of the core functions and cognitive processes that make us uniquely human, to devalue our contributions down the line. So it's one of the things that we need to be cautious of, and any approaches that we adopt should aim to encourage metacognitive awareness from that standpoint to make sure that we're not doing that. And that relates exactly to the idea of whether or not we should opt to offload or not offload specific tasks to these models. There are potential uses, but we need to be cautious. We need more evidence from that standpoint. But I don't accept the idea that it's a foregone conclusion that the only outcome that can result from generative AI is negative in respect of learning. The evidence doesn't bear that out. It bears it out if we have unrestricted use and people use it irresponsibly, but there are studies to suggest that it's actually a bit more nuanced than that. And in that space, tailored and open source models could be great as well. And the idea of open source models could create community driven initiatives where we're not reliant on big tech or these multinational corporations and their influence on the education system and our schools. There's also that the directory itself isn't a foregone conclusion, but I would argue that to make sure that it isn't a foregone conclusion, we need to be involved and we need to direct it and we need to be active. We need to be communicating with one another, sharing ideas, and trying to come away from the peripheries of both that unchecked enthusiasm, but also the outright rejection. We need to involve subject and curricular experts at all levels. There needs to be determinations of at what stage do we want to talk about what AI is? What stage do we think would be appropriate to bring it into the education system? Are there minimum levels of domain knowledge and expertise or skill that students should have demonstrated before they're allowed to use an AI model? And all of this would be determined in conjunction with the experts in those subject areas, the teachers and everything like that. But those conversations need to happen. And I haven't seen a lot happening from that perspective as it stands. And the final thing that I would just say is trust. A lot of the narratives out there rely on the fact that they just assume that the only way that this technology can be used is to completely outsource all our thinking and all of our work. And that's leading to institutions making decisions around going back to exams because they don't trust students, and people not trusting other individuals to check, the outputs and all that. I like to think that if a teacher or an educator has decided to use this technology, it won't be in every instance, but I would like to think that they're using their professional knowledge and expertise to be able to evaluate this technology, that they're using it because they find some value to it in their professional lives. And it's not just okay to just completely outsource that in terms of people are just being irresponsible to use of the technology. So I think building trust in the community is really important from that standpoint too. So I think that is my speed run through the presentation. I'll throw up my contact information there as well in case anybody does want to reach out. We've got time left over for questions and answers, which is absolutely brilliant. If I don't know the answer, I'll just ask ChatGPT, and if ChatGPT doesn't know, I'm sure it'll make something up anyway. So we're going to be covered from that perspective. But thank you all so much for listening to me speed through many different topics in the last 50 minutes, and hopefully we've got some good questions.
Thank you, Keith. That's really, really good. Thank you very much. So the way we're going to do the questions, if you have questions, just put your hand up and I'll unmute you and make your video available. So we have a question here from Geraldine. Just one moment, Geraldine. Okay. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Geraldine. You might need to unmute yourself there.
On that. Hi, thanks so much for that. Really interesting, um, and great to get such up-to-date research in the area. I'm just wondering if, from a practical point of view, might there be a repository anywhere or anything that's starting to develop as of yet in relation to assessments that would be useful, that kind of like work with AI as opposed to anything else? Like I've some myself that I'd be happy to share and happy to, talk about my experience if people were interested. So if there was anywhere to kind of put that, or it would be great, you know.
I haven't come across any individual repositories right now, but I know individuals that are working in the area, like Anna Mills and Leon Furr's the AI assessment scale. He's done so much around assessment there as well. But also
Who is that? Sorry, did you repeat that?
Leon Furr. There's Anna Mills, does a lot of work in writing and using AI as part of that process.
Okay.
Leon Furr's for the AI assessment scale, and just let me find the other one here because name from that standpoint, it's the Lodge et al. Paper. Oh, I don't have it in there. Give me 1 second.
There was a one I had come across at a conference in Germany. There's two academics in the UK.
Yeah.
It's called the AI Forge. I'll see if I can find the link,
Oh,
and
yeah, that'd be great.
I'll pop it into the chat, because it's not loads of different AI forges come up, but this one is I found good. And just in terms of AI for education, I must say I find it really positive in terms of using it. The students are going to use it anyway, so I show them how to use it, and once they get over the shock that I'm letting them use it,
Yeah.
they actually use it responsibly, I find. So it's kind of, again, it's just another layer of how we teach, the same way that we teach how to search for information in library databases, and how we search, and it's just a different tool and different way of searching. I found it positive so far.
Yeah, that'd be my experience with it as well. I have those conversations with them, and basically, this is why you don't want to use it to outsource your thinking, because these are all the things that it's not good at.
Yes.
Sorry, just the other two names that came up to me: Jason Lodge and Philip Dawson, and they're doing a lot of great work in the context of AI and assessment in third level. So
Thank you.
definitely check them out. But send me on the link to the AI.
I'm gonna find that link now for you.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, Geraldine. Catherine, do you have a question?
I don't have a question per se, but just a reminder, because I know a lot of staff will already be doing this anyways. But if you are thinking about using generative AI in your classroom or for assessment or anything like that, make sure you connect in with ICT and data compliance, because we do have lists of approved and unapproved technologies. And if you're bringing in a new technology for your students within the college context, you just want to make sure that it's been fully checked and approved, so that we don't have any type of data breaches or anything like that. We do have information about that that's up on the generative AI MIC microsite. So if you want to look there, you can look at that. But it can be really helpful to talk to them as well, because they know what's already in use and what's not. So just a reminder there. But I'll leave you back to answering questions, Keith. You've been doing a fab job. It's a really good presentation.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any more questions? Okay. I think we're good. Thank you so much, Keith. It's been really, really interesting, really eye-opening as well. Just get that really, really good balanced view. So thank you very much. And again, we'll have this talk available up on our YouTube channel and the iCare website later on today. So feel free to share with your colleagues or whoever you wish. And I just want to leave that with you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.